1971. This is the state of the Vietnam War. The United States was withdrawing out of South Vietnam, and South Vietnam was itself being equipped to continue the war on its own. Vietnamization was underway. Between 1969 and 1972, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, expanded from 825,000 to over 1 million men. To facilitate this, American military aid sent over 1 million M16s, 40,000 radios, 20,000 trucks, and military aircraft like the A-1, A-37, and F-5 fighters. The American Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV, focused on building military schools to create more capable officers, and 12,000 ARVN officers were brought to the United States for advanced training. At the same time, the US military was pulling out. From a 1968 peak of almost 600,000 combat troops, by January 1972, only 158,120 were left in South Vietnam. An additional 58,000 would be withdrawn between February and April. By March, only 2 combat brigades would remain in Vietnam. Even with these withdrawals, the South Vietnamese military was growing. It was slowly filling in the shoes left behind by Allied forces. The South Vietnamese government was finding its footholds even during the war. Under Nguyễn Văn II, the government had been stable for about 5 years. The leadership structure was set, and all generals obeyed the president without trying to overthrow him. Pacification was also making steady progress in the countryside. The Cambodian incursion in 1970 had severely damaged communist logistic lines on the southern part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Because of this, in 3 and 4 Corps, communist forces did not have the influence and strongholds it had in the mid-1960s. In these areas, their only major bases were all in Cambodia. The only major North Vietnamese bases within the country were in I and II Corps, typically protected by mountains. But on the coast and major population centers, the South Vietnamese government had total control. Vietnamization appeared to be working. By contrast, North Vietnam's economy was faltering. After heavy American bombing campaigns, the country was shattered industrially and agriculturally. Even 3 years after the stop of strategic bombing, the rice crop only grew from 4 million metric tons to 5 million in the period of 1968 to 1971. The factories, coal exports, and storage facilities were destroyed. Electric capacity was only at 1/3. Because of this, many North Vietnamese leaders, like Prime Minister Trung Trinh, wanted to focus on rebuilding the country rather than attacking the South. Only after rebuilding the economy could they start to think of engaging South Vietnam again. However, North Vietnam did not really have a manufacturing weapons base that could be bombed in the first place. Most of its military supplies came straight from its communist sponsors in the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. Because of this, even with the bombing, the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, was still able to be equipped for war. But because of the military failure of the Tet Offensive in 1968, North Vietnamese leadership was extremely hesitant to execute any major offensives. They had previously concluded that another all-out offensive would be far too costly and give minimal gains. The Tet Offensive had failed them 3 years ago, and now, South Vietnam was only stronger. By 1971, the North Vietnamese were on the defensive, trying to rebuild from previous Allied operations, rather than conduct attacks themselves. But then, Operation Lam Son 719 kicked off. It was an operation conducted by the South Vietnamese Airborne and 1st Divisions, some of South Vietnam's best infantry units, into Laos. The operation's objective was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail at the Chapone Junction, destroying supplies and troops on the way to South Vietnam to fight. However, due to South Vietnamese inexperience and American miscommunication, the operation failed and South Vietnamese units had to retreat chaotically with heavy casualties. But for the North Vietnamese, they did not manage to exploit the situation either. North Vietnamese units did not counterattack successfully until South Vietnamese forces were already withdrawing. It was the first time North Vietnamese soldiers attempted to use armor and heavy artillery together with infantry, and it was a mess. Dozens of tanks were destroyed as a result. While the operation was a failure for South Vietnam, it wasn't a success for the North either. However, the North Vietnamese leadership could clearly see that while South Vietnam was steadily gaining strength, it was still very much trying to figure out how to operate independently from the US. Seeing the results of Lam Son 719 and North Vietnam's faltering campaign in South Vietnam, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Lê Duẩn, decided that another offensive must be launched. The North Vietnamese had to act now. At this point, Vietnamization was still in progress. The longer the North Vietnamese waited, the stronger the South Vietnamese army became. Additionally, the Americans were not quite out yet. If this offensive went well, the North Vietnamese could claim that they defeated American soldiers on the field and disgraced the Americans internationally. Lê Duẩn managed to convince the rest of the Politburo to launch this offensive in the following year of 1972. For this new offensive, called the Nguyễn Huệ Offensive, North Vietnam would use combined arms warfare. To achieve this, Hanoi appealed to both the Soviet Union and China. Both countries were normalizing their relationships with the Americans, but it begged the question, who were the true communists? Nixon was planning to visit China, and Hanoi took the opportunity to accuse the Americans of taking actions to divide the communist world. The Chinese saw that the accusations also implicated them, and immediately sent down a diplomat to guarantee Hanoi continued support in person. Moscow saw the Chinese move, and they themselves sent down a representative to promise aid. While both Moscow and Beijing were talking with the Americans, they still had to demonstrate that they continued to support the People's Communist Revolution on the international stage. North Vietnam immediately received 2,000 new trucks and 10,000 tons of oil and gasoline. US intelligence estimated that North Vietnamese aid from both the Chinese and Soviets would be around $1.5 billion during this period in time. Additionally, the Soviets shipped the North Vietnamese T-54 main battle tanks and 130mm howitzers. The T-54 was comparable to the American M48 Patton MBT, but with significant quality issues. The 130mm howitzer, however, was state-of-the-art and outranged everything the Americans and South Vietnamese had, except for the 175mm howitzer, which was quite rare and wildly inaccurate at long ranges. The Soviets also started delivering the AT-3 Stagger anti-tank and SA-7 anti-aircraft guided missiles. 3,000 North Vietnamese crewmen were sent straight to the Soviet Union to learn how to use the T-54s. By the end of 1971, 20 whole battalions of tanks and heavy equipment, along with the 320A Division and other independent regiments and battalions, were sent straight to the south. With all of this, the North Vietnamese were handsomely equipped for the offensive. The Nguyễn Huệ Offensive would consist of 3 massive combined arms prongs hitting 3 major locations at the same time, and it was aimed for the 1972 dry season at the end of March. The South Vietnamese and Americans have never faced anything like this before in Vietnam. On the South Vietnamese and American side, throughout the last quarter of 1971, American and South Vietnamese intelligence predicted that the North Vietnamese were making no special effort for 1972. Intelligence had a network of sensors and scouts all throughout the Ho Chi Minh Trail, ready to detect any men and materiel moving down to South Vietnam. There wasn't any change, and it stayed that way up until the end of November. Then, in December, Allied intelligence suddenly sent shocking reports. A massive tank park was discovered in Laos near what US analysts called Bat Lake. This was the largest concentration of armor discovered from the North Vietnamese up to this point in the war. The sensors and reports went haywire. Massive amounts of North Vietnamese soldiers and materiel were heading down south. While the North Vietnamese typically tried to obscure the flow of men and equipment down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the sheer volume of tanks and trucks was impossible to hide. The North Vietnamese were planning something huge for 1972. But would it be like Tet 1968, where all locations in South Vietnam were hit? Or would it only be an I Corps? Or possibly I Corps and 2 Corps? Would it take place during the Tet holiday again in February? The key questions were when and where, and it was impossible to know until it actually happened. These questions were definitely being asked in 3 Corps. Many soldiers hoped that the brunt of the offensive would take place in I and 2 Corps. The leftovers would attack them, if they decided to attack there at all. 3 Corps was further away than I Corps or 2 Corps, so there was the possibility that it would not be attacked if the North Vietnamese decided to only launch an offensive in the first 2 regions. Lieutenant General Nguyễn Văn Minh commanded Military Region 3, and was advised by Major General James Hollingsworth and his deputy Brigadier General John McGiffert. Hollingsworth was a true American, aggressive and blunt. He was absolutely crucial in advising General Min's command of 3 Corps. The entire region of 3 Corps had 3 regular ARVN divisions protecting it, more specifically Saigon. The 5th Division protected Saigon from the north, the 25th from the west, and the 18th the east. Anywhere the enemy attacked throughout the area, a different division would have to take responsibility for it, which was exactly what each division commander was anxious about. From north of 3 Corps, the People's Army of Vietnam could strike from Phước Long, Bình Long, or Tây Ninh provinces. The largest population center between these 3 provinces was Tây Ninh. Because of this, previous communist attacks usually took place there, with the hope that the people would rise up and join them. If Tây Ninh was attacked, then that would be the responsibility of the 25th Division. However, if Phước Long or Bình Long provinces were attacked, then that would fall under the responsibility of the 5th. Each division commander hoped that they would not be the main target. Opposing General Min was Lieutenant General Tran Văn Cha, B-2 front commander in the People's Army of Vietnam. He would become quite famous after the war for publishing a series of volumes which revealed how Hanoi overestimated its own capabilities and led to the failure of the Tet Offensive. He was put under house arrest for the rest of his life. However, in 1972, he was commanding the equivalent of a Communist Army Corps. 3 infantry divisions, the 5th commanded by Senior Colonel Bùi Thanh Văn, the 7th commanded by Colonel Đàm Văn Nguyệt, and the 9th commanded by General Nguyễn Thới Bừng, plus an additional 4 independent infantry regiments reported directly to him. Alongside the infantry were specialty troop units, including tank battalions and an artillery division which included dedicated anti-aircraft units. While the 5th and 9th divisions were formerly National Liberation Front divisions, at this point in the war, their personnel were mainly North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese clearly knew their enemies did not know which province they would attack. Previously, Communist forces focused on Tây Ninh province since there was a large population center there, but this time, they decided to strike Bình Long. Looking at a population density map, the population of Bình Long was only 77,000 as of February 1972, compared to the 396,000 of Tây Ninh. Its 2 northern towns, Lọc Ninh and An Lộc, only had 4,000 and 15,000 people living in them, respectively. It did not have the population of Tây Ninh, so an attack there seemed unlikely, which is why this time, the communists chose it. But Bình Long had something that Tây Ninh did not. Quốc lộ 13, or National Highway 13. It ran straight through the province, through Bình Dương province below it, and straight to Saigon. If the People's Army of Vietnam managed to take Bình Long, they had a highway right into their enemy's capital. Additionally, Highway 13 was the only road between An Lộc and the ARVN 5th Division's headquarters at Lai Khe. If it could be cut off, any units north would be completely stranded. As well, since Bình Long province was so sparsely populated, its defenses were quite underdeveloped. An Lộc itself was barely fortified. It only had some bunkers and a dirt mound around it. Because of these factors, the communist attack was planned out as follows. To take advantage of ARVN not knowing where they would attack, the 24th and 271st Independent Regiments would first hit Tây Ninh as a diversion. Then the 5th NLF Division would capture Lọc Ninh. The 9th NLF Division would take An Lộc. The 7th Pavan Division would cut Highway 13 south of An Lộc to cut off the city. All of these divisions, each containing roughly 10,000 men each, would move simultaneously and achieve their objectives within 5 to 10 days. Supporting these infantry divisions was the 69th Artillery Division, equipped with 122mm howitzers, 107 and 122mm rockets, and mortars. It also had the internal 271st Anti-Aircraft Regiment, armed with 12.7mm, 23mm, and 37mm anti-aircraft guns. Almost 4,000 men were in this division. 2 battalions of the 203rd Tank Regiment and the 202nd Special Weapons Tank Regiments would spearhead the assaults along with the infantry. They were equipped with the Soviet T-54 and Chinese Type 59 main battle tanks. These tanks were accompanied with PT-76 amphibious light tanks and other mechanized vehicles. All of these armored vehicles had never been used this far south before. Additionally, the infantry were armed with the brand new SA-7 Strela heat-seeking missiles, perfect for countering the helicopters and light attack aircraft that the US Air Force and Vietnam Air Force were equipped with. At this point, the war had completely changed. Just in this location alone, there were about 35,000 men armed with some of the best weaponry the communist world could muster, all aiming to seize the province of Bình Long. American and South Vietnamese forces definitely did not know what was coming. Facing the brunt of this corps-level offensive was the 5th ARVN Division and its commanding officer, Brigadier General Lê Văn Hưng. The 5th was charged with guarding Phước Long, Bình Long, and Bình Dương provinces. The headquarters was based out of Lai Khe. The 5th Division had 3 infantry regiments under its command, the 7th, 8th, and 9th Regiments. At the northernmost province of Bình Long, the 9th Regiment, under the command of Colonel Nguyễn was deployed around the Lọc Ninh area. 2 of its battalions and 2 of its artillery batteries were based out of Lọc Ninh itself. 2 companies from the 2nd Battalion, along with 2 155 and 4 105mm guns, were located at the Gamlay Bridge between Lọc Ninh and An Lộc. An additional 2 infantry companies from the 9th, the 1st Armored Cavalry Squadron, a battery of 105mm and 155mm howitzers, and the 74th Border Ranger Battalion were located at Fire Support Base Alpha, right next to the Cambodian border, called Task Force 15. The last 9th Regiment Battalion was deployed in Phước Long Province. The 7th Regiment was based out of FSB 1 west of An Loc. The base had 2 155mm and 4 105mm guns. 2 of its 1st Battalion companies were located at Quân Lai on the other side of An Loc with 2 105mm guns. The 8th Regiment was deployed in Bình Dương Province, south of Bình Long. Advising the 5th Division was Colonel William Miller with a team of 15 to 20 advisors also located in Lai Khe. Each of the 3 regiments had their own advisor teams of 2 to 5 men. Unfortunately, Colonel Miller and General Hung did not have a very good relationship. Due to the structure of South Vietnam's armed forces, each province had its own military structure. It did not command formal ARVN men, but rather regional forces and popular forces, nicknamed the Rough Puffs, paramilitaries that were trained for pacification. This force was commanded by the province chief, Colonel Tran Văn Nhật, who was regarded quite well as commander. He had around 2,000 men, a platoon of V-100 cars, and a single 105mm cannon platoon spread all throughout the hamlets in the province. Another advisory team of 20 advisors, led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Corley, supported Colonel Nhật. With the communist buildup in Cambodia, South Vietnam did not just stand still. Seeing the probable strike against either Dai Ninh or Bình Long, Task Force 52 was formed on March 21st and sent to Bình Long. It was made of several units from the 18th Division, the 2nd Battalion of the 52nd Regiment, and the 1st Battalion of the 48th Regiment. There was also the Intel and Recon Company, 1 battery of 105mm guns and a platoon of 155mm howitzers, and B Company from the 18th Engineers. This group was known as Task Force 52 and was based out of twin fire bases, FSB North and FSB South west of An Loc. It had roughly 1,000 men and was deployed under the operational control of the 5th. Altogether, about 15,000 South Vietnamese soldiers would face the 35,000-man offensive. They just didn't know how big it would be, and their commanders hoped that they would be spared from the destruction when the People's Army of Vietnam went for Dai Ninh instead, just like they always did. The big question was, where was the attack going to take place? The generals and officers commanding the 15,000 men in Bình Long province dreaded that the attack would hit them. Several months earlier, in November 1971 to January 1972, the 5th ARVN Division conducted very small operations into Cambodia. There wasn't much contact with PAVN or NLF units. In February and March 1972, intelligence identified the 7th and 9th PAVN Divisions in Cambodia, in a spot that could go to either Dai Ninh or Bình Long. The 5th NLF Division was discovered at Base Area 712. Again, it could go to either Dai Ninh or Bình Long. intelligence suggested that Dai Ninh was more likely to be hit. On March 13th, a South Vietnamese task force made up of parts of the 3rd Armored Brigade and the 3rd, 5th, and 6th Ranger Groups hit base areas 354 and 708. It managed to overrun the local enemy headquarters and seize several depots. One depot had thousands of tons of equipment, which was then destroyed by the 25th Division sending in a regiment. It was another piece of confirmation for the offensive to come. On March 16th, 3 North Vietnamese were captured while they were scouting the area. One of them was the executive officer for the NLF's 272nd Regiment of the 9th Division. His documents indicated that the camps were being set up west of An Loc. Another document captured in March directed the 9th to move to base area 708 right on the border, coordinating with the 7th Pavan Division and to execute urban combat training. This training had been discontinued for communist units way back in 1969, back when the Tet Offensive had failed. Unfortunately, the sheer volume of material and data to sift through meant that these documents were drowned in all of the noise. Even then, several more Pavan scouts captured revealed that the North Vietnamese were moving towards Bình Long. A defector revealed that he was scouting out a route from Dai Ninh to Bình Long. Other soldiers were looking at artillery positions that would point their guns down Highway 13. However, intelligence, as well as Generals Hollingsworth and Min, were convinced that the attack would hit Dai Ninh. Nothing was confirmed, since all 3 communist units were still between both provinces. They could go either way. Then, on the 30th of March, the hammer fell. The People's Army of Vietnam shook the world when 3 of its divisions opened fire and charged straight into the northern provinces in I Corps. Its tanks smashed the 3rd Division and pushed the elite Marine units back, seizing much of Quảng Trị province immediately. All of Saigon's attention was focused towards I Corps in horror. Meanwhile, 2 Corps and 3 Corps watched on helplessly, because all the signs showed that they would be next. They couldn't help I Corps, but they wouldn't get much help either. And on April 2nd, right in the morning, North Vietnamese units attacked Dai Ninh province. The 24th Regiment, with tanks, hit FSB Lọc Ninh and managed to rout the lone battalion of the 25th Division that was there by noon. General Min sent orders down to evacuate the FSBs near the border. It would be better to withdraw to better positions rather than remain isolated. Unfortunately, when the unit at FSB Tiên Ngon tried to withdraw, it was ambushed by the 271st Pavan Regiment and lost most of their vehicles and artillery. Dai Ninh City was now vulnerable to attack. The 25th Division responded with reinforcements to that same location the following day, but the enemy had gone. Curiously, they left behind the artillery. They had always taken it in the past, but it was still here when the reinforcements arrived. Something was wrong. These attacks on Dai Ninh convinced the American and South Vietnamese 3 Corps leadership that it was the center of attack. But nothing happened. Weeks later, intelligence would figure out that only smaller units had attacked the area. Nobody paid attention to the 5th and 9th Divisions during the Dai Ninh strikes, and by the time intelligence managed to piece the clues together, Lọc Ninh was under direct attack. The 7th Division's attack on Dai Ninh was a distraction. Simultaneously, the 9th had moved into base area 708, and the 5th had snuck in on Lọc Ninh from the north, and were now 10 kilometers west of the town. With the distraction complete, the 7th proceeded to move south between An Loc and Lai Khe to prepare to cut Highway 13. But, anticipating the attack on Lọc Ninh, Colonel Miller, the advisor to Brigadier General Lê Văn Hưng, commander of the 5th Division, urged him to move fast and reposition all of his units to make a stand at Lọc Ninh. Miller viewed this position as readily defendable. Unfortunately, the two had a personality clash. Like many other South Vietnamese generals who were used to the more slow-paced culture of East Asia, General Hưng appeared very aloof and was definitely not fast-acting like American officers tend to be. Also, like many South Vietnamese officers, he resented American interference in his command since it did not fit with the Vietnamese way of doing things. Because of this, he did not actively seek advice from Colonel Miller. The first serious example of this cultural clash was when Colonel Miller requested General Hưng to swap out the 9th Regiment's commander, Lieutenant General Nguyễn. Unfortunately, Vinh had been in the war for 18 years and had been conditioned to be passive rather than active to survive. Colonel Miller had previously talked directly with Vinh, and seeing him heavily demoralized, determined that he would not be good for a regiment about to receive a full frontal assault by a Pavan division. General Hung would not make the decision in time to either reinforce Lọc Ninh nor withdraw the 9th back to An Lộc, and it would stand to face the entire Communist 5th Division with Vinh as command. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Vinh had 5 advisors present to assist him, led by Lieutenant Colonel Schott. All of them were located at the 9th Regiment headquarters in the South Compound, next to the airfield. Like Miller, they saw that Vinh was far too passive to lead the defense properly. There were an additional 2 advisors advising the Lọc Ninh district commander in the North Compound, under the Rough Puff branch. On April 4th, 3 of the 9th Regiment advisors drove a jeep up Highway 13 from Lai Khe to Lọc Ninh. They saw vehicles full of civilians heading south, running away from the North Vietnamese. It was the first sign of the attack to come. Later that day, the 9th Recon Company ran straight into a Pavan regiment west of Lọc Ninh and was almost completely wiped out by tanks and infantry. In the evening, a patrol from 3rd Battalion ambushed and captured a 5-man squad south of Lọc Ninh. They told their captors that their division, the NLF 9th Division, was bypassing Lọc Ninh entirely to head straight for An Lộc. The North Vietnamese were executing their maneuvers, and Lọc Ninh was the closest to them. On April 5, 1972, at 3 a.m., a massive barrage of heavy artillery, rockets, and mortars opened up on the Lọc Ninh compound. Other bombardments broke out throughout Bình Long province. Vinh immediately ordered the isolated Task Force 1-5 back from their FSB Alpha. His advisor, Lieutenant Colonel Schott, immediately told him to keep them within Alpha since it was too late to make it to Lọc Ninh. But the troops had already left after 15 minutes. At 3:35, the cavalry commander of 1-5 called to inform Vinh of his surrender. Vinh could only nod and say he understood. Captain Smith snapped and grabbed the radio and told the commander to fight. If he did not, then Smith would have to call an airstrike right on him. The commander said that he would try. Later, the Rangers and other infantry called to say that the cavalry were heading west with the enemy. Smith immediately called an AC-130 Spectre to the area, and it reported hitting armored vehicles, but could not confirm whether they were the surrendered South Vietnamese or North Vietnamese armor. The rest of 1-5 continued to proceed to Lọc Ninh. But by this point, Vinh and Smith had a lot more to worry about. During the heavy barrage, 2 full Pavan regiments, supported by 25 tanks, appeared out of the rubber trees from the west. The soldiers in the compound all fought hard and managed to hold back the attack, with tactical airstrikes providing much-needed support against the armor. Captain Smith rallied the crew of the compound's single 106mm recoilless rifle crew, and they managed to hit a T-54 and it screeched to a halt. At around 6 a.m., the air support ran out for about 30 to 40 minutes. During the gap in support, tanks managed to break right through the front line. Luckily, some fighter bombers arrived right on time and pushed the tanks back. At this point, ARVN gunners in the center compound had lowered their 105mm cannons to fire at the communists directly. Meanwhile, Generals Hollingsworth and Minh, currently at Bien Hoa, directed all tactical air support they could in the area to Lọc Ninh. The United States Air Force immediately rerouted A-37 Dragonflies, F-4 Phantoms, and AC-130 Spectres. The Vietnam Air Force sent its own F-5s and A-1s. Unfortunately for these aircraft, the North Vietnamese were setting up a very dense anti-aircraft net with 12.7mm, 23mm, and 37mm AA guns. The People's Army of Vietnam knew from experience that airstrikes were the United States and South Vietnam's main support method, and they came prepared. The generals themselves boarded a helicopter and headed north to monitor the situation directly. It was at this point Task Force 1-5 managed to reach the intersection of Highways 13 and 14. Funnily enough, they had previously left a single M41 tank with 5 M113 APCs there, climbed aboard and headed straight for Lọc Ninh. Unfortunately, just north of the town, they ran right into a North Vietnamese ambush and got stuck there. They called Colonel Vinh, and Vinh told them to return back to Alpha. Captain Smith ran over to take the radio again to stop them from doing that, since Alpha had probably been taken now. If they went back, it would be a death sentence. For now, they would continue to fight their way towards Lọc Ninh. At noon, Pavan gathered forces to the southwest and launched a major attack. They reached the wire right at the edge of the compound when an AC-130 appeared just in time to annihilate them. Another attack appeared from the east. They had made it to the wire when they were stopped by Cobras. However, one of the helicopters were hit by ground fire. It fell from 4,000 feet and exploded when it hit the ground with no survivors. It was the first Cobra lost in An Lộc. The anti-air net was being deployed in force. It wasn't just the anti-aircraft fire that was deployed in force. The troops on the ground were hit by artillery and rockets continually. Recoilless rifles and tanks that stayed back fired directly at ARVN positions. All while the 9th Regiment was under direct attack, the 7th Regiment at FSB-1 started to get hit by enemy troops and artillery. Colonel Miller and General Hung debated over what to do, and eventually Hung was convinced to pull the 7th back to An Lộc. Meanwhile, back at Lọc Ninh, there were an additional 2 companies from the 3rd Battalion of the 9th Regiment west of the town. They had managed to fight their way back to help defend Lọc Ninh. Unfortunately, they ran straight into an ambush. Only 20 of them made it back into the perimeter. In the evening, the direct assault ceased, and the bombardment slowed down. The troops inside could rest for a bit, but everybody was anxious. The North Vietnamese were definitely regrouping for their attack tomorrow. Later that evening, 2 T-54s rolled forward in a small probe. The ARVN 106mm recoilless rifle crew engaged it and managed to kill one of them. The other fell back. Right after, at around 10 p.m., Colonel Vinh decided to open the compound gates. Smith confronted him directly and Vinh said he was preparing to run out easier when the town was overrun. This made all the American advisors lose faith in Vinh completely. The rest of the night passed quietly. The next day, on April 6th, right before dawn, the bombardment increased in intensity. Smaller probing attacks continued to occur throughout the morning up until noon. The advisors and 9th Regiment leadership determined that the main assault would occur in the afternoon. At noon, the east perimeter reported civilians walking towards the compound. The North Vietnamese had forced them out of the town nearby towards the base. Captain Smith fired his rifle into the air to scatter them back to their houses. At the same time, General Hung and Colonel Miller were in the air. North of Juan Tan, they saw a column of vehicles right on Highway 13. Flying closer, they could see that these were North Vietnamese vehicles. Command had known that the 5th NLF Division was currently hitting Lọc Ninh, and the 9th Pavan was heading towards An Lộc, but they didn't know where the 7th was. Now they know, and they set up a roadblock right there at the location to cut off An Lộc. The situation suddenly turned critical. Back at Lọc Ninh, it was now afternoon. The bombardment became relentless, and a Pavan battalion appeared with tanks and charged straight at the perimeter. Another Pavan company stormed the front gate from the southeast. A Spectre had to fly between the 2 locations to provide cover for both locations. It managed to push back the tanks, but several Pavan groups managed to get in the wire. US Air Force fighters had to be used to scatter them with cluster bombs. At this point, the AA fire became so intense that helicopters had to be called off entirely. Only fast-moving aircraft were allowed to provide support now. The helicopters could not send in supplies or pull the wounded out. Even then, the rest of the day passed, and the South Vietnamese soldiers inside were still holding on. In the evening, there were no armored or infantry attacks, only a shell falling then and again. Only 50 soldiers were left defending the 9th Regiment compound, and 20 rough puffs in the district compound. It was unknown how many men were left on the outer perimeter. 150 wounded were in the hospital, but the surgeon was forced to send some of them back out to the front lines, still wounded. They went without complaint. Any straggling soldiers that were left outside the town had now arrived, and would face the following day's assault together. It was almost midnight when a massive volley of 240mm rockets opened up. Many hit the hospital bunker and killed all the wounded. The rockets also hit the artillery compound, destroying many of the guns and killing much of the crew. The ammunition dump was hit and it exploded. General Hollingsworth was in the air and he saw what looked like a nuclear explosion. Captain Smith saw that PAVN had driven rocket trucks right up to the compound and fired at point-blank range. It was absolutely devastating. At the same time, the North Vietnamese launched a major assault of infantry and tanks again. It was repulsed, but all of the 106mm recoilless rounds were gone. There was next to nothing left that was capable of destroying tanks. Then, it was quiet again. That morning of April 7th, plenty of bodies, North and South Vietnamese, were seen tangled up in the wire. But nobody could pay attention to that, because at 5:30 a.m., everybody could hear the tanks preparing to attack them again. At 7, the massive assault was launched with tanks and APCs, supported by recoilless rifles and rockets. An hour into the attack, Vinh ran out the front gate to surrender. The executive officer had replaced the South Vietnamese flag with his white shirt. Captain Smith ran over to rip it down and put the flag back up. Some soldiers nearby started to take off their shirts to surrender as well, but when they saw the flag go back up, they returned to their post. Unfortunately, it wouldn't mean much. At 9:30 a.m., another wave of attacks was launched. The number of men defending the compound continued to dwindle. As for the perimeter, nobody was sure how many were left. But there was one thing for sure. There was absolutely no way to defend anymore. Groups of ARVN soldiers were still holding out here and there, but T-54s had breached the perimeter at all locations, firing directly into bunkers and buildings to clean them out. Another advisor, Major Divison in the Rough Puff compound, had spotted a large group of tanks. He directly contacted General Hollingsworth and a nearby forward air controller to request support. A Spectre checked in and asked him to start a nearby jeep to show his location. The Spectre then proceeded to hit everything but the jeep. Fighters finished off the rest of the tanks. At this point, air support was the only thing stopping the North Vietnamese from finishing off the compound. All advisors started to call air support on their own positions. At 6:30 p.m., Captain Smith decided it was now time to try to run. Just a few hours earlier, he was shot in the back by a sniper. Luckily, he was wearing a radio and it took most of the damage, but the bullet ended up in his lung. Lieutenant Colonel Schott himself had received a very serious head wound. He had to be flown out. But since the anti-aircraft net was set up, helicopters could not fly in. To be sure he wouldn't drag down the other advisors, Colonel Schott took his own life. It was also at this point in time that the radio contact was completely lost with all advisors to Lọc Ninh from the outside. Whatever happened next to those advisors and the remaining men of the 9th Regiment would be fate. Lọc Ninh had fallen, and the ARVN 5th Division's 9th Regiment was destroyed. From the northern compound, advisors Davidson and Wanet and the District Chief Major Tin proceeded towards An Loc. They all became split up. Wanet was captured after 31 days of trying to get to An Loc. Tin had made it to An Loc by himself. Davidson, with only his Vietnamese interpreter, managed to make it to South Vietnamese Rangers on the 12th. As for the 9th Regimental compound, advisors Smith and Law, with the South Vietnamese Regimental Surgeon and a squad of ARVN soldiers, ran south. They ran straight into PAVN soldiers and ended up in a firefight. Smith took some hits and couldn't keep going. The surgeon stayed with him and they were captured by the North Vietnamese. Law continued on with the rest of the group, but was never heard from again. Lọc Ninh's fall was a disaster. For the Americans, an entire team of advisors was gone. Colonel Miller and General Hollingsworth had decided to pull out the advisors far too late. And except for the several men that managed to make it to An Loc, nothing would be heard from the others until the prisoner exchange in 1973. For the South Vietnamese, the entire 9th Regiment was destroyed, along with Task Force 1-5. Strategically, General Hung had two major options, either reinforce Lọc Ninh and make a stand there, or withdraw all forces back to An Loc and hold there. He decided to withdraw to An Loc far too late, and now the entire 9th Regiment was gone. The few men who managed to make it to An Loc later confirmed that around 1,000 soldiers had surrendered at Lọc Ninh. Out of the 3 regiments that the 5th ARVN Division had available, one of them was completely crushed by the NLF 5th Division. There were 2 other North Vietnamese divisions entering the battlefield, ready to go. While the fall of Lọc Ninh was imminent on April 7th, Lieutenant General Nguyễn Văn Minh was summoned to Saigon to meet with the Joint General Staff, the President, and the 3 other Corps commanders. He requested reinforcements and argued that if An Loc fell, then not much would stand between the North Vietnamese and Saigon. Unfortunately for him, III Corps was at the back of everybody's minds. General Min had lost a full regiment, but in I Corps, the entirety of the 3rd Division was smashed and on full retreat with the nearby elite Marine brigades. He was dismissed from the room. However, the Joint General Staff would later inform him that he would receive the 21st ARVN Division from 4 Corps, as well as the 1st Airborne Brigade, one of the elite units of South Vietnam. They were thinking of sending him the 9th Division initially, but Lieutenant General Ngo Quang Trung, one of South Vietnam's best generals, and commander of 4 Corps, reasoned that the 21st was very well trained in search and destroy operations, and had also been previously commanded by General Min, so they should be the ones to go. After the meeting, President Nguyễn declared on radio that An Lộc would be defended to the death. This was confirmation that III Corps would receive the support it needed. It would be all or nothing, and the North Vietnamese listening in would try to take it at all costs as a result. It would be a morale disaster for South Vietnam if An Lộc fell now. Back in Bình Long province, Task Force 52 in FSB's North and South watched in horror at the fall of Lọc Ninh. Several days before, they had engaged North Vietnamese patrols. It was commanded by Colonel Tin, and he had the support of 3 American advisors led by Lieutenant Colonel Ginger. On April 5th, General Hung ordered Tin to send a battalion north to reinforce Lọc Ninh. He sent his 2nd Battalion of the 52nd Regiment, but they ran into an ambush on the way up. The FSBs fired 600 rounds of artillery in support, but it could not proceed any further. FSBs North and South then started to receive a massive bombardment. On the morning of April 7th, General Hung ordered Colonel Tin to withdraw Task Force 52 to An Lộc. At 8:30 a.m., they started to move out. But 400 meters out, they were hit by an ambush. They could not proceed any further, so General Hung gave the order to destroy as much equipment as possible and move to An Lộc by foot by bypassing the road. The 2 battalions were supposed to proceed evenly, but the 2nd Battalion of the 52nd Regiment were engaged in the rear by Pavan forces. They rushed forward and started to group up with the 1st Battalion of the 48th. At this critical point, artillery started to bombard the group. Airstrikes had to be called in at 1 p.m. to cover the troops. Unfortunately, they ran into a massive clearing. When they crossed, the task force would be completely exposed to enemy fire. The command team just started to cross, and the North Vietnamese immediately opened fire. One of the advisors, Zimwalt, was severely wounded by a B-40 explosion, and Lieutenant Colonel Ginger was forced to request a helicopter evacuation for the advisors. They would stay behind to be extracted while Colonel Tin and his soldiers would proceed to An Lộc on foot. The rest of the day, there were 2 attempts to extract the advisors, which failed. They had to stay in the area throughout the night, with a Spectre covering them. That morning, they were extracted by 2 OH-6s, along with numerous ARVN soldiers clinging onto the skids. At the same time, only around 600 of the original 1,000 soldiers of Task Force 52 made it to An Lộc. It wasn't just Task Force 52 that arrived. At this time, many of the men that would fight in the city itself were arriving into the city. General Min ordered the 3rd Ranger Group and its 36th and 52nd Battalions to withdraw from the border to An Lộc. They would arrive on April 7th. At the same time, the Vietnam Air Force was flying in as many supplies as they could. C-123s, Chinooks, and Hueys all flew in ammunition and food. For the Americans, General Hollingsworth ordered all non-essential administration and staff evacuated out of An Lộc. Looking at the situation in MR1, Hollingsworth saw that pulling out the advisors shattered ARVN morale. He therefore informed the remaining advisors that they would stay and fight or die with their South Vietnamese counterparts. Colonel Nhut, commander of the Rough Puffs, started to distribute M72 laws to his infantry as much as possible, as well as accommodating incoming refugees from Lọc Ninh and other towns. He was regarded very highly by American advisors. Impressed by Nhut's own preparation, Colonel Miller attempted to persuade General Hung to give command of the defense to Nhut, but Hung did not reply. The working relationship between the 2 men fell into dysfunction. At this point in time, there was the Quan Lai position with 2 companies from the 1st Battalion, 7th Regiment. It was the last outlying location outside the city itself. This was where the first blow would fall. The North Vietnamese definitely had to get this position out of the way to fully surround the city. In the afternoon of April 6th, the previous day, they probed the perimeter of An Loc. The two ARVN companies managed to push them back with the help of some American Cobras. But on the evening of April 7th, several units of the 9th NLF Division used tear gas and nausea gas to push the companies out. The ARVN companies managed to destroy both of their 105mm guns and would make it to An Loc 2 days later on April 9th. It was at this point in time that the airborne started to arrive. Hollingsworth had tried to get Minh to send the airborne 1st Brigade into An Loc as well, but Minh decided to use them to try to break the roadblock between An Loc and Lai Khe. The 1st Airborne Brigade arrived in the town on April 8th. It had the 5th, 6th, and 8th Airborne Battalions. However, it also had the best battalion in the entirety of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the 81st Airborne Ranger Battalion. They combined the best traits of both the Airborne and the Rangers, both considered to be the best units South Vietnam could offer. It immediately started to proceed north up Highway 13. It then ran straight into a PAVN position just 3 miles north of Dun Tan. This was the confirmation that North Vietnamese forces had An Loc fully surrounded. Fortunately for the South Vietnamese, the People's Army of Vietnam was still deploying its soldiers for the next couple of days. The heavy artillery, tanks, and armored personnel carriers would take time to move around the city. In this small break from the fighting, the Vietnam Air Force flew in as many supplies as it could. Also, Task Force 52 arrived on April 8th, and Hung immediately deployed them to the center of An Loc. Hung also ordered the 7th Regiment and 2 companies at Cam Le back to An Loc. On April 9th, the 9th NLF Division was almost in position to strike. It sent small probes at 5:30 a.m. from the east, west, and north, then withdrew at 9. The next day, they did the same thing and backed off at 7:15 a.m., but still, they would not commit to any serious attack. The 8th Regiment that was in Bình Long Province was brought in by American helicopters on April 10th and 11th. The following day, the last of the 7th Regiment finished arriving into An Loc. Other than several 18th Division advisors that would fly in on the 12th, that would be the last of the men coming into An Loc before the battle. This force of roughly 3,000 would take the brunt of the first PAVN attacks. Fortunately for those in An Loc, the requested 21st Division from the Mekong Delta started to ship into Bình Long Province. The advance party arrived in Lai Khe on April 8th, then the 32nd Regiment arrived on the 10th. They started to deploy towards Dun Tan by truck and reached it without incident. The 31st Regiment started to arrive on the 11th. PAVN tanks and trucks were then reported to the northeast of Dun Tan, seemingly trying to cut the highway. General Nghi, commander of the 21st, immediately ordered a high-speed advance led by the 31st, supported by armor from the 9th Armored Cavalry Regiment, to cut them off. The task force heavily contacted the 101st PAVN Regiment, losing 3 tanks immediately. South Vietnamese Sky Raiders and American Phantoms and Stingers had to come in to provide support. In the chaos, the force retreated 6 kilometers. Unfortunately for the men in An Loc, this would only be a sample of what their rescuers would face trying to reach them. The soldiers of the 21st Division were facing the well-entrenched 7th PAVN Division. The remainder of the 21st, the 33rd Regiment, and other supporting units finished being airlifted in on the 12th. General Minh ordered them to hold their positions for now. There was still a heavy possibility that PAVN units would simply pull back from An Loc and just push straight towards Saigon. Back at An Loc, on April 12th, a Vietnam Air Force Chinook was hit directly with a mortar, ending all Chinook flights into An Loc. Supplies would have to be sent in by VNAF C-123s and C-119 fixed-wing transport aircraft. The anti-aircraft net was finally being set up around An Loc. It looked like the People's Army of Vietnam was ready to attack. Early on April 13th, the Communists unleashed a massive barrage of 7,000 shells on the city. At 4 a.m., the sound of tanks and trucks were reported outside of the city. Mines went off as North Vietnamese troops launched probes on the defensive perimeter. The barrage increased to the point where, at 5:30 a.m., the fuel and ammunition dumps were ignited. At 6 a.m., the People's Army of Vietnam launched 2 massive combined arm assaults from the northeast and west. A large column of T-54s and PT-76s came down the main northern road to An Loc. Task Force 52, which had left all of their heavy weaponry back at FSB's north and south, panicked at the sight of the tanks. Colonel Tin, with the help of his advisors, managed to rally his troops and join the Rough Puffs. The 3rd Ranger Group and 8th Regiment also fell back from the assault, but managed to create defensive positions to hold on. Like the rest of 3 Corps ARVN soldiers, this was the very first time they ever had to fight tanks. To fill in the gap left by Task Force 52, General Hung ordered the Rangers to extend their lines to the center and fill in the gap, taking Colonel Miller's advice. Only the 7th Regiment did not fall back, but were pushed to the city limits. Even with the gap temporarily closed, the T-54s were still advancing down Highway 13 directly towards the 5th Division headquarters. Colonel Miller requested support, and a flight of Cobras equipped with high-explosive anti-tank rockets flew in to strike the tanks directly. The first Cobra managed to destroy the first tank just north of the headquarters. Airstrikes were simultaneously called in on the anti-aircraft fire around the city to make sure the Cobras could operate properly. The Cobras belonged to the 79th Aerial Rocket Artillery, nicknamed the Blue Max Squadron. Blue Max would come to be extremely important in providing direct fire for ARVN forces on the ground, where tactical air and B-52 Arclights could not. Only they had the precision needed to destroy tanks right next to ARVN position. Even with Cobras destroying many tanks, they continued rolling down the street. It was at this point that 3 Rough Puffs gathered the courage to destroy a T-54 that had reached the south gate with M72 Laws. On the west side, a single Rough Puff soldier overcame his fear and hit a T-54 right under the turret, destroying it. To the northeast, a single Ranger ran out to destroy a T-54 by himself. The advisor, Captain Moffat, said that this single event electrified the Rangers. Up until now, even the advisors themselves weren't sure if the small tube weapon could take out a whole tank. American soldiers themselves never went up against T-54s in Vietnam. Except for I-Corps advisors just 2 weeks ago, American soldiers never had to use laws against tanks. But with the small acts of courage, word spread quickly amongst the South Vietnamese soldiers. Troops all over the city ran out to destroy the tanks. Many of the tank crews themselves had completely outran their infantry support. They were left completely blind and vulnerable, randomly rolling around An Loc's streets. Because of this, tanks were destroyed throughout the city. 4 more tanks were knocked out. Another tank decided to fire all of its ammunition into a Catholic church, killing over 100 civilians praying inside. The crew climbed out to surrender after using all of their ammunition, and nearby South Vietnamese soldiers who witnessed this responded by emptying their rifles into the crew. Even with tanks running around An Loc, infantry were still assaulting the perimeter of the city. Due to 3 of the major units falling back in chaos, General Hung and the rest of the 5th Division HQ were not sure where their soldiers were. Tactical airstrikes were deployed well behind An Loc since the pilots didn't want to hit their own soldiers, but it also missed the majority of North Vietnamese troops. However, Cobras with their onboard precision equipment could distinguish targets much more easily. Cobras themselves managed to stop a tank column by destroying the lead, middle, and last tank. Even then, 5 of the Blue Max Cobras were shot down on April 12th. There was another assault at 10 a.m. from the northwest. A T-54 managed to break through and rolled around the city until it reached the province HQ and got stuck. There was only one 105mm cannon left in the city as the bombardment destroyed the rest. Rough Puff Captain Kai lowered his cannon and aimed it straight at the T-54 to destroy it. Colonel Nhut promoted him to major right there. However, by 11:30, the 9th Division managed to take the northern part of An Loc. They were extremely close to overrunning ARVN position. Only airstrikes managed to slow the attacks enough for them to be held off. American advisor Wilbanks later stated that the Cobras were often the difference between victory and defeat. Of course, strike aircraft, fighters, and gunships were present to hit targets further from the front lines. In the morning of April 13th, the situation stabilized. The fighting devolved into house-to-house fighting as both sides fought over every single inch of An Loc. At the end of the day, with the first assault unsuccessful, PAVN forces pulled back, allowing ARVN soldiers in An Loc to relax under the constant bombardment of heavy artillery. All tanks that had made it within the perimeter were destroyed. The defense structure for An Loc was now set in stone. General Hung commanded the ARVN ground troops, while Colonel Miller directed American air support. Advisors made sure that they were always awake 24 hours to ensure total coverage of air support. If they had no artillery, then heavy firepower had to come from airstrikes instead. At this point, I Corps was starting to stabilize, and B-52 arc light strikes could start to be diverted to the area. On the morning of April 14th, Pavan forces pulled back a little bit, pouring in artillery fire. Then, at 7:45 a.m., a combined assault of 9 T-54s and 2 anti-air tanks struck from the northwest with some infantry squads and made it within 100 meters of the 5th Division headquarters before being pushed back by airstrikes and ARVN infantry. It was during this time that ARVN soldiers developed dedicated tank hunting teams that would run around to destroy tanks. These teams would hit the tanks from basements or second floors so that the tanks couldn't hit them back. Also, the Pavan infantry were held back by the front lines while the tanks broke through, leaving their armor completely vulnerable. By the end of April 15th, infantry had destroyed 18 tanks and Cobra gunships got 12. The 5th Division's second in command, Colonel Lê Nguyên V, himself destroyed 4 of them. But it wasn't just the infantry and tactical airstrikes inflicting damage on the North Vietnamese. B-52 arc lights were especially devastating, annihilating everything within a 1 km by 10 km box and debilitating anybody within 1 kilometer of the strike zone. In one attack, a battalion was caught directly northwest of An Loc by an arc light right before it entered the city. 3 tanks were destroyed, and an estimated 100 men were killed. However, even with the airstrikes and South Vietnamese infantry holding on, the communist bombardment increased in intensity. The same day, General Minh ordered the 1st Airborne Brigade to disengage from their positions on Highway 13 to be redeployed directly to An Loc. Its 6th Battalion entered the battlefield at 4 p.m. near Hill 169 southeast of An Loc via helicopter. They immediately raced the North Vietnamese on the other side of the hill for the top, and their advisors had to call airstrikes for support. In a desperate situation, one of the airborne companies performed an infantry charge to force the North Vietnamese right off the hill. The arrival of the Airborne, one of the elite units of South Vietnam, greatly boosted the morale of the remaining men in An Loc. The South Vietnamese forces in An Loc had survived another day. The next morning, April 15th, Pavan opened with a barrage at 4:30 a.m. It focused on the city center itself and set many of the buildings on fire. At 6 a.m., 2 combined armed thrusts, led by tanks, were launched from the north and west. After learning how to chase down and destroy the tanks on the 13th, the South Vietnamese soldiers knew to let the tanks push ahead of the infantry. While the North Vietnamese infantry could not keep up and were bogged down by the perimeter, the tanks were easily killed by M72 logs. South Vietnamese soldiers were so confident at destroying tanks, they competed to see who could kill the most. However, the scale of the attack pushed the 8th Regiment back several streets before they managed to re-establish a new defensive line. At 10 a.m., the Communists launched another massive attack. The entire 271st Regiment engaged the west, while in the southeast, they reached the barbed wire. A tank made it to 100 meters of the 5th Division command bunker, firing directly into it and wounding 3 officers. An American Cobra had to be called in to destroy the tank. At this point, the anti-air net was so intense that aircraft had a difficult time to provide supporting fire and taxi out the wounded. At 2 p.m., another attack was launched from the west with 10 tanks. 9 of them were destroyed by strike aircraft. The 271st Regiment continued assaulting the western perimeter of An Loc until an arc light landed right in its location. An entire battalion was destroyed, stopping the attack. At the same time, the 5th and 8th Airborne Battalion, along with the crack 81st Airborne Rangers, landed southeast of An Loc, then moved towards the city. The 6th Battalion stayed behind to build an FSB for 6 105mm cannons being lifted in. The entire 1st Airborne Brigade was now in the fight for An Loc. If the Airborne were here, it was all or nothing. During the fighting, a group of 200 refugees tried to break out of the city, led by a Catholic priest. The Communists opened fire with rockets and artillery, killing many of them and driving the survivors back into An Loc. The food and medicine situation in the city was worsening, and the Vietnam Air Force could not send enough in. The AA net was so intense that flights had to be made at 5,000 feet, and at that altitude, supplies falling via parachute drifted completely off target. Worse yet, a Vietnam Air Force C-123 was shot down, killing all on board. The United States Air Force, in response, started its own resupply missions with C-130s. 3 C-130s flew in at a low altitude of 600 feet, using computers to calculate when to drop the supplies. The PAVN anti-air net barely reacted in time to fire at the first aircraft and only managed to damage its rudder. However, the second C-130 flew directly into a wall of anti-air fire. It killed the flight engineer and wounded 2 other crew members. Ammunition pallets started to ignite and explode seconds after exiting the plane. 2 engines were destroyed, and the plane barely made it back to Dunsanyut Air Base, with a 3rd engine failing at the last second. The last C-130 did not start its resupply run due to technical issues. None of the supplies were ever recovered by soldiers in An Lộc. This would only be the very first of many failed resupply attempts by both American and Vietnamese flight crews. On April 16th, the battle relaxed. The bombardment continued relentlessly, firing up to 2,000 shells into the city, but the 9th NLF Division had exhausted its manpower for direct assaults. It was in the afternoon that airborne battalions were in position to push through the communist circle to get into the city. The 8th Battalion reached South An Lộc without engaging, but the 5th Battalion fought PAVN forces for 6 hours before they withdrew. The 5th Airborne made defensive positions east of An Lộc. The elite 81st Airborne Rangers took position in the northeast corner. Immediately that evening, its commander requested that the 5th Division stop all use of flares. Its soldiers started to immediately clear out houses in complete darkness. Even in the break-in fighting, the ammunition dump in Lai Khe was hit directly, resulting in 8,000 artillery shells being completely destroyed. Another group of refugees, this time led by Buddhist monks, was cut down again by communist artillery when they tried to escape An Lộc. 2 C-130s attempted to resupply the city. They were hit directly by anti-air fire but managed to drop 30,000 pounds of supplies. The following day, a C-130 ran into a wall of anti-air fire and was forced to crash land near Lai Khe. The resupply missions were still very risky for small gains. On April 17th, the bombardment continued, but the 9th NLF Division did not launch any new assaults. The first major North Vietnamese assault on An Lộc ended with the South Vietnamese barely holding on. However, the worst of the fighting had yet to come. On April 18th, Border Rangers engaged PAVN forces near Ton Le Cham and found documents on a political officer. The first letter reprimanded the 9th NLF Division for failing to take the city. But it was the second letter that was more concerning. It was a plan for new attacks to take An Lộc. The 9th 271st Regiment would attack from the west like before, the 272nd from the north, and the 95C Regiment from the northeast. 2 additional regiments from the 7th and 5th Divisions entered the battlefield. The 5th NLF Division's 275th Regiment and the 7th PAVN Division's 141st Regiment would smash the 6th Airborne position on Windy Hill. The 5th NLF, which had taken Lọc Ninh, were resupplied, refreshed, and started to reach An Lộc to join the fight. In total, this was 5 infantry regiments, along with supporting armored, artillery, and anti-aircraft units operating in An Lộc. The relief force, the 21st ARVN Division from the Mekong Delta, were completely bogged down trying to make it up Highway 13. They were trying to force their way northwards, and fighting was reduced to complete attrition trying to make it to the city. For the South Vietnamese forces, it was clear that this wasn't just some small cutoff force on the highway, but the entire 7th PAVN Division facing them. While South Vietnamese forces in An Lộc had survived, there wasn't much hope for survival in the near future. The North Vietnamese controlled half the city. The 5th Division advisor, Colonel Miller, was pessimistic and said that the division is tired and worn out. Supplies minimal, casualties continue to mount. Medical supplies are low, wounded a major problem, mass burials for military and civilians, morale at a low ebb. In spite of incurring heavy losses from US airstrikes, the enemy continues to persist. His relationship with General Hung collapsed completely. With the new communist assault planned and on the way, it didn't look like there would be much to stop it. During April 16th, 17th, and 18th, the communist forces around An Lộc stopped attacking to regroup and resupply. It did not accomplish its major objective to take An Lộc by the 15th, but it certainly was not going to give up. 5 regiments made preparations to hit An Lộc simultaneously. The 9th 271st Regiment would attack from the west, the 272nd from the north, and the 95C from the northeast. The 5th NLF Division's 275th Regiment and 7th Pavan Division's 141st Regiment would destroy the airborne east of An Loc. Its new plan was to take An Loc within 5 to 10 days. So sure of victory, the communists declared publicly that the city would fall on the 20th of April. On the morning of April 19th, the communist forces started a massive artillery bombardment encompassing all of An Loc. Afterwards, all 3 9th Division regiments launched their assaults into the city. The second major attack to seize An Loc started. At the same time, the 275th and 141st Regiments attacked the airborne southeast of the city with 6 tanks. The 6th Airborne Battalion, alone on its fire support base with 6 405mm cannons, faced the equivalent of 6 communist battalions. It was completely smashed and thrown off the hills. The first company was destroyed, and the 2 other had to disable their guns to withdraw. While all 6 tanks were destroyed by laws and airstrikes, none of it made a difference. Lieutenant Colonel Din, the commander of the 6th, had his men dig a foxhole, jumped in, and resolved to die. One of the advisors, First Lieutenant Ross Kelly, managed to lead a small breakout of 60 airborne that were later extracted by helicopter 2 days later. However, the 6th Airborne Battalion was rendered completely combat ineffective. With the defeat of the 6th Airborne, the last supporting artillery in the area were completely gone. Only airstrikes could provide heavy fire support now. The 5th and 8th Airborne Battalions, however, were closer to the city. The 5th was just east of An Loc, and the 8th was in the south. They could not be surrounded like the 6th, and held off attacks from the 275th and 141st Regiments, which assaulted them right after destroying the Windy Hill position. The 9th Division made desperate assaults from the east, north, and northeast for days, but were held back by the 5th Division, Rangers, and Rough Puffs. Advisors called in airstrikes close to friendly positions, helping South Vietnamese troops hold off the assault. Arc lights smashed North Vietnamese buildups before they could attack in full force. While the 6th Airborne were destroyed, the rest of the attack on An Loc failed. The 1st Airborne Brigade command post was moved into An Loc on April 21st. The 9th NLF Division, even with 2 extra regiments from the 5th and 9th Divisions, made 3 days of desperate attacks to try to meet the publicized April 20th deadline. Unfortunately, it passed, and the second attempt to take An Loc ended in failure. The attack slowed down on April 22nd as a result. The North Vietnamese couldn't take any more ground. In this lull in fighting, the elite 81st Airborne Rangers decided to take the initiative and launched small counterattacks into northern An Loc during the night. Sergeant First Class Jess Yurta, advisor with the 81st, directly called in supporting fire from an AC-130 Spectre in person. However, the 81st Airborne Rangers did not gain too much ground. At this point, both sides were stuck. Neither could make gains. The North Vietnamese held North An Loc, while the South Vietnamese held the southern half. Unfortunately, the less than 4,000 remaining South Vietnamese soldiers were trapped with around 20,000 civilians. The intense artillery bombardment of 1,000 to 2,000 shells a day forced everybody underground. Food and medical supplies were stretched thin. The Pavan realized this and forced any civilians they could find into the city to exacerbate the problem. All civilians that tried to flee were met with communist artillery and forced back in. President Nguyễn would later claim that their artillery killed 25,000 refugees trying to escape all 3 battlefields of An Loc, Kon Tum, and Quảng Trị. However, even with the sheer misery in An Loc, the second attempt to seize An Loc failed. Even then, while the North Vietnamese could not take An Loc by force, that did not mean they were defeated. If frontal assaults could not work, then the communists could try to outlast the defenders in a prolonged siege. They could starve the defenders out. Their anti-aircraft net of 23mm, 27mm, and 57mm AA guns in an estimated 9 anti-air battalions were deployed around the city. On April 19th, another Vietnam Air Force C-123 was shot down, and the Vietnam Air Force had to completely stop all low-altitude resupplies. The previous day, a US Air Force C-130 was hit by intense anti-air fire and was forced to crash land near Lai Khe. The North Vietnamese could definitely starve out the South Vietnamese soldiers. The Vietnam and US Air Force were still trying to figure out how to resupply the soldiers in An Loc without losing aircraft. A new delivery system, dropping supplies from a high altitude, and using a device to open the parachutes at low altitude was created, called High Altitude Low Opening, or the HALO system. Unfortunately, it was very unreliable and many deliveries crashed into the ground. In one instance, a pilot hit a command bunker directly and wounded soldiers. While this allowed aircraft to fly at 6,000 feet, safe from AA fire, the retrieval rate for supplies was very dismal. The situation was so desperate that some 5th Division men fired towards ARVN Rangers trying to retrieve supplies. Resupply for the city would continue to be a serious issue for weeks. Morale was stagnant. South Vietnamese forces could only wait, and Colonel Miller failed to get General Hung to push his forces to try to retake North An Loc. Hung refused to give any order like this, and many South Vietnamese troops hoped that the US airstrikes would continue to hold the North Vietnamese back. Even then, for the next couple of weeks, the men in An Loc could take a small break. Far south of An Loc, for the men of the 21st Division trying to make their way to break the siege, this was when the fiercest fighting started. On the 22nd of April, a refugee column with a blue bus was moving from Jun Tan to Lai Khe between the 32nd and 33rd Regiments. PAVN units started to open fire on the column, hitting the blue bus with an RPG, killing 4 and wounding 20 civilians. The North Vietnamese had maneuvered their 101st Regiment right between both regiments. Realizing that the communists were in between, the 32nd Regiment struck southwards, and the 33rd Regiment struck northwards to try to clear the obstruction. Due to the destroyed blue bus in the center of the fighting, this engagement would be referred to as the Battle of the Blue Bus by 21st Division American advisors. After 5 days of very fierce fighting through bunkers and trenches, the two regiments linked up on April 29th, forcing the 101st out. A battalion from the 165th PAVN Regiment, attached to the 101st, acted as a rearguard while the 101st withdrew west. At the same time, on April 24th, the 31st Regiment was airlifted to the north of Jun Tan to safeguard the town while the Battle of the Blue Bus was finishing up. They would start to push forward on the 29th after being given arc-light strikes ahead of the advance. Right in front of the 31st was the well-entrenched PAVN 165th Regiment. On May 1st, the 31st got stuck in a heavy engagement with the 165th, becoming bogged down in the fighting and unable to progress. This would be called the Battle of Benchmark 75 afterwards. It took 5 days of 8 arc lights, 142 tactical airstrikes, and an extremely heavy artillery bombardment to smash the 165th. It was during this time, on May 4th, that the North Vietnamese soldiers deployed the AT-3 Sager wire-guided anti-tank missile for the first time in 3 Corps. It had previously been seen in I Corps and 2 Corps, but not this far south up until now. It was used with limited success. Unfortunately, just as the 165th was on the verge of being destroyed by airstrikes and the advance of the 31st Regiment, the 209th PAVN Regiment arrived just in time to take the defense and allow the 165th to withdraw and reinforce. The 31st ARVN Regiment was stuck once again. The 21st Division, as a whole, kept on getting bogged down in trying to destroy trench networks and bunkers, and at this point, reaching An Loc was unthinkable. Resupply efforts were still relatively unsuccessful. High-altitude C-130 flights had a low delivery percentage. On April 20th, only 45 out of 845 tons sent were retrieved by South Vietnamese forces inside the city. The US Air Force resorted to trying to deliver supplies during nighttime at low altitude, with C-130s painted black, but it was very difficult to deliver supplies in complete darkness. Additionally, the North Vietnamese figured out the pattern and managed to shoot down 2 C-130s on April 24th and May 3rd respectively, with all crew members lost. Worse yet, on April 29th, an SA-7 guided missile was reportedly launched at an aircraft. This completely stopped all low-altitude resupply flights. General Hollingsworth estimated that only 30% of supplies made it to South Vietnamese hands. The resupply effort was still only inconsistent at best, making the situation in the city tense. Even with the continued siege of An Loc, the failure to take the city by the publicly announced date of April 20th started to demoralize the North Vietnamese. The 9th NLF Division commander, Colonel Nguyễn was criticized for failing to take An Lộc. B2 front leadership decided to give command of the attack to the 5th NLF Division. Colonel Van declared that his division would show the 9th how it should be done. The 5th had taken Lọc Ninh, and its commander was confident he could take An Lộc. His plan was to concentrate his attacks to divide South Vietnamese forces in half and crush each isolated group. Anti-aircraft guns would move along with these units to destroy strike aircraft. His headquarters moved to Hill 169 overlooking the city on May 1st. The 5th Division's E6 and 174th Regiments moved into the area. Along with the 141st Regiment already in the area, the 7th Pavan Division's 165th Regiment moved north towards southern An Lộc. The fresh 21st Tank Battalion also arrived. Now, there were a total of 7 Communist regiments surrounding the city. The South Vietnamese soldiers in An Lộc were facing one final battle against 7 regiments with a critical supply shortage, and the 21st could only inch forward when they were miles away. The remains of the 5th Division, the Airborne 1st Brigade, the Rough Puffs, and the Rangers were waiting in the city. There were only 4,000 ARVN soldiers left, with 1,000 of them wounded. The constant bombardment made sure that the 4,000 men remaining were all stuck underground, along with about 20,000 civilians hiding with them. The supply situation was critical. Resupply efforts had resulted in numerous helicopters and heavy lift aircraft being destroyed. Soldiers and civilians alike barely ate and could not tend to the wounded without medical supplies. The Communist 5th, 7th, and 9th Divisions, along with armored, artillery, and anti-aircraft units, completely surrounded the city. They were making preparations for their 3rd major assault on An Lộc. The South Vietnamese prepared for the attack on the ground, while the Americans organized their war in the air. General Hollingsworth planned 18 B-52 boxes and 200 TAC air for air support. Luckily, the fighting in Kon Tum and Quảng Trị, the other 2 theaters of battle, had momentarily subsided. General Abrams, commander of the U.S. Assistance Command in South Vietnam, promised Hollingsworth as much air support as needed for the next few days. It was on May 8th that the resupply effort finally improved significantly. The U.S. Air Force and Vietnam Air Force were forced to use halo drops to resupply due to the presence of Strela-guided missiles. Up until now, these drops had mixed results. However, American and Vietnamese riggers worked 24-hour shifts. Drop experts were flown in from Taiwan to help find any acceptable solution. The rig teams finally found the solution. Using drogue chutes instead of regular parachutes, the supplies would hit the ground accurately but not be destroyed. But it was fast enough not to be blown off course by the wind. Immediately, 140 pallets were dropped over the next 2 days, with 139 of them landing at the correct location. It was the breakthrough desperately needed. However, the final Pavan assault was imminent. The supply situation was only solved just shy of the next major attack. It may not have been fast enough. South of An Lộc, the 21st Division was still trying to push forward, spearheaded by the 31st ARVN Regiment attempting to dislodge the Pavan 209th and 165th Regiments. The Battle of Benchmark 75 was still underway. On May 6th, the 31st attempted a series of maneuvers to try to break through. The 1st and 2nd Battalions would try to force their way around the flanks of the eastern group of defenses. 2 days later, on May 8th, the 3rd Battalion airlifted north of the block to apply as much pressure as possible. The following day, on April 9th, this attempted breakthrough met with disaster. The commander of the 31st Regiment was critically wounded and could not command. The maneuvers, which had been making progress up until this point, completely stalled without his leadership. Meanwhile, in An Lộc, after a couple weeks of preparations, the 5th NLF Division was prepared for its attack on the city. At 5:30 a.m., there were very strong probes around the city. This lasted for 2 hours. Then the North Vietnamese withdrew. Right after, the bombardment heavily increased. At this critical moment, General Hollingsworth decided to pull out Colonel Miller, the 5th Division's advisor, and replace him. Unfortunately, he was completely worn out after a month of fighting, and his working relationship with General Hung was gone. He was replaced by Colonel Ulmer, another experienced officer who had served in Vietnam previously. The two men were complete opposites in personality. Colonel Miller was very aggressive and proactive, whereas Colonel Ulmer was much more measured and technical. This new dynamic would hopefully work better with General Hung. The following day, on the morning of May 10th, Colonel Ulmer was flown right into An Loc via helicopter, and Colonel Miller climbed aboard to leave the battlefield. Ulmer was aware that Colonel Miller and General Hung's relationship was dysfunctional, but was willing to be open-minded about the South Vietnamese general. Instantly, he saw that while General Hung looked detached, he was clearly in command and never buckled. Starting in the morning, the North Vietnamese forces continuously launched probes, testing the South Vietnamese defenses. One of the probes from the east forced the 52nd Rangers to break and fall back, one of the few times the Rangers performed poorly. Gradually, the North Vietnamese withdrew and increased the artillery bombardment again. General Hollingsworth decided to add 7 more arc-light boxes to the already pre-existing 18 and requested that Abrams give him a B-52 every 55 minutes. Starting at 12:35 a.m. on May 11th, the North Vietnamese increased the bombardment heavily. A shell fell every 5 seconds. All of this fell into a 1,000 by 1,500 yard area. 7,500 shells fell on South Vietnamese positions for 4 hours, then stopped completely at 4:30 a.m. It was completely quiet for 30 minutes. For the defenders, they knew that the artillery was letting up for the infantry and tanks to start moving forward. At 5 a.m., the bombardment recommenced, but this time supporting the full combined arms assaults from all sides. These assaults focused on the north and northwest, intending to cut the South Vietnamese in half. 40 tanks spearheaded the attack. The 275th Regiment assaulted the 81st Airborne Rangers and managed to force them back. 3 tanks broke through the front lines, but were eventually hunted down and destroyed. From the west, the 272nd Pavan Regiment smashed into the 7th ARVN Regiment and forced its 3rd Battalion back. 2 tanks were destroyed by the soldiers, but the North Vietnamese pushed within 300 meters of the 5th Division HQ. Other North Vietnamese units attacked the Rough Puffs, Task Force 52, and the rest of the airborne, but did not gain much ground. However, in the 2 major assaults, the North Vietnamese formed 2 large salients and continued to pour men and tanks in to try to join them together and divide the South Vietnamese forces in 2. American airstrikes continued to provide direct support for the South Vietnamese, but the North Vietnamese had a new weapon deployed. The SA-7 Strela guided anti-aircraft missile was used throughout the day against helicopters and attack aircraft. Some pilots previously reported it before, but this was the first time it was confirmed concretely. With the addition of the Strela, anything flying under 10,000 feet was at serious risk of being shot out of the sky. Up until now, it was only seen in I Corps. Even then, strike aircraft continued their support at maximum strength. Without artillery, if air support couldn't come in, defeat on the ground was guaranteed. In addition to the Strela missiles, 23mm and 37mm AA cannons, along with ZSU-57 anti-aircraft tanks, were brought in to try to shut out the airstrikes. With this air cover, the North Vietnamese forces were on the brink of being victorious. The 2 salients were just a couple hundred meters from each other. If they managed to link up, then the South Vietnamese forces could be destroyed by crushing each of the halves one after the other. Fortunately, when the 271st Regiment had almost reached the 5th Division HQ, they attacked northeast instead of southeast, taking the Public Works building instead. It was a critical mistake. If this force had proceeded towards the command post, it probably would have won the battle. General Hung and his new advisor determined the enemy's intent to divide and conquer. He immediately ordered the 5th Airborne off of the southern perimeter and into the city. They followed these orders immediately and stopped the salients dead in their tracks. The US Air Force AC-130s and Vietnam Air Force A-1 Sky Raiders started to focus on the salients when they were stalled, forcing them back. It was close enough that a T-54 had managed to start firing directly on the 5th Division command post, but an American A-37 destroyed it. The North Vietnamese assaults were shattered by the end of the afternoon. The attacks could not make any more progress. All 40 tanks that participated in the assault were verified to have been destroyed or abandoned. 297 direct airstrikes were called in throughout the day to keep the North Vietnamese back. The prearranged arc lights were devastating. two of which were redirected at the last second to save nearby South Vietnamese units. All of this added up to success for the South Vietnamese soldiers on the ground. Even then, heavy anti-aircraft fire managed to shoot down a Vietnam Air Force A-1, an A-37, 2 Cobras, and 2 FAC-02s. While An Loc was facing the brunt of his own North Vietnamese full-scale assault, the rescuing force, stuck trying to force its way up Highway 13, faced its own disasters. The 31st Regiment was operating blind without the directions of its commander and could not push forward. Part of the 2nd Battalion of the 32nd Regiment was overrun by a PAVN attack, resulting in the battalion's second-in-command being killed with his American advisor. On the following day, May 12th, command of the 31st Regiment was given to the 32nd Regiment commander to try to salvage the situation and restart progress towards An Loc. Back in the city, the PAVN regiments launched another major assault throughout the An Loc perimeter. Tanks started to break through, but fortunately for the South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese had to stall their bombardment to make sure that they didn't hit their own tanks. South Vietnamese soldiers immediately ran out to hunt the tanks and engage the North Vietnamese in close quarters combat. The elite 81st Airborne Rangers at one point saw a column of T-54s approaching from the east along Route 303. The Airborne Rangers knew it would have to cross a bridge and made a plan to wait for the first tank to reach the middle of the bridge, then destroy it. They moved right next to the bridge and shot 6 M72 rockets right into the side, stopping it and the column dead in their tracks. That night, bad weather grounded the tactical strikes. Taking advantage of this, PAVN launched major assaults with PT-76s from the north and east, infantry engaging from all directions. The tanks stayed back to provide direct fire support. Hollingsworth immediately compensated for the lack of direct strike aircraft with 6 arc lights extremely close to friendly position. Then the weather cleared up. At midnight, a couple of AC-130 Spectres flew in to provide fire support. After May the 11th and 12th, the heavy bombardment continued, but the North Vietnamese did not have the manpower and materiel to launch any more all-out assaults like before. At 1:45 a.m. on May 14th, South Vietnamese soldiers spotted movement and received tank fire from the west. 3 arc lights at that location immediately silenced the threat. Another attempted assault was stopped by an arc light. Even then, throughout May 13th and 14th, the North Vietnamese kept hold of An Loc's northern half. By May 15th, the North Vietnamese forces had withdrawn a little bit back from An Loc. They simply could not attack anymore. The bombardment calmed down. The third attempt by the People's Army of Vietnam to seize An Loc was finally over. However, the siege would continue. While the city itself stood, PAVN were definitely not going to give up. If they couldn't seize it by force, they could definitely try to whittle the defenders down. B-2 Front leadership decided to switch to a strategy of besieging, wearing down, and destroying enemy personnel. PAVN redeployed its units accordingly. Fortunately for the South Vietnamese, resupply had returned to a steady routine. Even with the North Vietnamese change in strategy, they were not at risk of being starved into defeat. The halo drops with the drove chutes guaranteed that An Loc would hold, for now. Just as the attacks relented on the city, the 21st Division finally managed to break up the defensive positions of the 209th Regiment on May 13th. The Battle of Benchmark 75 was finally over, but the 21st Division was still 17 kilometers away from An Loc. They continued to push northwards. However, they would find that the reinforced 165th and the remainder of the 209th Regiments had taken up new positions just south of the Tao O stream. Unfortunately, this stream crossed Highway 13 with a single bridge over it. The stream also created a swamp around it that was very difficult to cross. The defenses consisted of interweaved, triangular bunkered positions, all connected by trenches and telephone lines. It was a formal defense in depth. Trying to break through these defenses would become a meat grinder very similar to that of World War I. In the jungle, maneuver warfare was meaningless. The change in strategy to strangling An Loc was being carried out. The North Vietnamese had pulled back from An Loc, but these units were not just withdrawn from Bình Long province. Rather, they were sent straight south to stop the 21st Division. The 7th PAVN Division's Recon Company, the 94th Sapper Company, and the 41st Anti-Tank Company arrived at Tao O to hold the line. On May 14th, The South Vietnamese advance completely ground to a halt at the bridge, and no amount of arc lights, tactical airstrikes, and artillery could help break through. Even then, the North Vietnamese took heavy casualties as well. The Battle of Dao O Bridge had just started, and would be the longest, deadliest engagement on Highway 13. The fierce fighting would continue for weeks as the South Vietnamese men could only gain 50 meters on some days, and no ground at all on others. Dao O would continue for 38 continuous days of fighting, well into June. However, the North Vietnamese couldn't do much either other than hold on. Well into the engagement, on May 23rd, they attempted to launch a counterattack of infantry and tanks. An AC-130 Spectre happened to be in the area and destroyed the tanks, forcing the infantry to retreat back to the defensive line. At An Loc, on the same day, an isolated attack of 6 to 8 tanks was launched from the south without infantry support. US Marine F-4s destroyed several of the tanks, and South Vietnamese men destroyed the rest. Another isolated assault on the 8th Airborne of 8 tanks was stopped and crushed. The last tank pretended to be dead, but then restarted with 2 airborne standing right on top of it. Those airborne soldiers eventually managed to pry the hatch open and throw a grenade in, killing the crew. For General Nguyễn Văn Minh, commander of 3 Corps, it was clear that An Loc was spared, but the situation definitely wasn't getting any better. An Loc still needed to be relinked up with the rest of 3 Corps. Fortunately, 2 months into the Easter Offensive, the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff concluded that North Vietnam only had attacks planned for I, 2, and 3 Corps. 4 Corps in the Mekong Delta was relatively free from major assaults. And in mid-May, General Minh was just granted operational control of a regiment from the 9th ARVN Division from the Mekong Delta, the 15th Regiment. Both the men at Dao O and An Loc desperately needed artillery support. General Hollingsworth advised General Minh to establish a fire support base at Tân Khai, right between both locations. On May 15th, the 21st Division's 9th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the 15th Regiment's 1st Battalion, and 3 howitzers started to force march around the east side of Dao O Bridge around Pavan defenses. Simultaneously, the 15th 2nd Battalion were airlifted slightly east of Tân Khai and moved into position. Over the next 2 days, Vietnam and US Air Force heavy lift helicopters would fly in 11 105mm and 4 155mm howitzers, as well as ammunition to the new Long Phi, or Flying Dragon FSB. A couple of battalions from the 21st Division's 33rd Regiment arrived by land later on. On May 18th, the FSB was fully secured. The last battalion of the 15th Regiment arrived. Task Force 15, composed of parts of the 15th Regiment, started to push northwards towards An Loc. Task Force 15 pushed along the west side of Highway 13, while the 33rd Regiment men pushed along the east side. This was the turning point in An Loc's rescue mission that was desperately needed, and the city's defenders experienced a significant morale boost. Help was finally on the way again. The North Vietnamese realized this. Immediately, they pulled the 141st Pavan Regiment back from An Loc and sent them straight to assault the FSB with 3 tanks on May 20th. The assault was repulsed by the end of May 22nd, and the North Vietnamese immediately started bombarding the FSB with mortars, rockets, and artillery, inflicting heavy casualties. Even then, the FSB continued to stand firm. Unfortunately for the North Vietnamese, it was pulling back the 141st Regiment from An Loc that guaranteed the city's survival. With the FSB still operational, the North Vietnamese decided to attack Task Force 15 1 kilometer away from Tân Bình village with heavy artillery fire on May 22nd. It caused major casualties, and the North Vietnamese men directly assaulted the task force directly with infantry, but were repulsed with 14 dead. Task Force 15 continued to push north towards An Loc. On May 24th, while the 9th Cavalry Squadron was returning back to Long Phi FSB with wounded, the 141st Regiment managed to ambush them and destroy 23 vehicles with recoilless rifles and RPGs. On May 25th, Task Force 15 itself got bogged down in trying to uproot Pavan defensive positions between them and An Loc. Due to the fierce fighting, only 239 men of Task Force 15 were still combat effective. The 33rd Regiment itself pushed a bit further, but were stopped by heavy Pavan resistance. The men pushing from Tân Khai base were now stuck trying to reach An Loc as well. The hope for relief inside the city was dashed, and morale dissipated. The 21st ARVN Division was stuck again. The threat of defeat was mostly gone, but the city was nowhere close to being relieved. The 21st Division was stuck between Long Phi FSB and An Lộc, as well as at Tàu O Bridge. Each day, South Vietnamese forces could only manage to push another 50 meters. Relief was still far away from the city. However, with the North Vietnamese focusing on stopping the relief force, the South Vietnamese soldiers in An Lộc started to be able to leave their bunkers. Astonishingly enough, while the rest of the town was reduced to dust and rubble, a singular South Vietnamese flag stood, along with an undamaged statue of the Virgin Mary in the town church. Airstrikes had destroyed much of the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft emplacements around the city, and helicopters could finally fly in reinforcements and supplies. The South Vietnamese soldiers started to set up patrols and launch assaults to widen the perimeter. One of these patrols outflanked a North Vietnamese bunker position in the west salient and forced them out. The further they pushed, the more North Vietnamese bodies they found. In some arc-light strike zones, a couple hundred bodies were found. On May 26th, casualty reports indicated that half of the 21st Division's 12,000 men were either killed or wounded. At Tàu O, captured North Vietnamese officers said that many of their companies only had 10 men left and that morale was starting to break down. Many of them refused to listen to orders. This would continue on for an additional month as the infantry threw themselves at each other. On June 19th, a coordinated effort with 13 tanks and infantry assaulted North Vietnamese defensive positions. Unfortunately, this force became bogged down in the fighting and bunched up. Mortar and rocket fire destroyed numerous tanks and killed an American advisor. The 21st Division men at Tàu O was only 17 kilometers away. Meanwhile, on June 4th, the reconstituted 6th Airborne Battalion flew into Tan Khai FSB. It was the same unit that was surrounded and crushed by the North Vietnamese in the earlier assault on An Lộc, and it finally returned to the battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyễn Văn Din had managed to survive and was leading it to avenge the 6th earlier destruction. They pushed northwards to where Task Force 15 and the 33rd Regiment were, and immediately encountered harsh enemy resistance on June 6th. The Airborne managed to destroy enemy positions and easily reach Task Force 15's positions 3 kilometers away from An Lộc the following day. On June 8th, Task Force 15 and the Airborne pushed forward, engaging Pavan soldiers near Tan Bình village. They managed to defeat them, leaving 73 North Vietnamese dead. That afternoon, the 6th met up with its sister units, the 8th and 5th Airborne Battalions, located south of An Lộc. The men in An Lộc could rejoice that their first reinforcements from Highway 13 had finally arrived. Even though An Lộc was reached, the Battle of Tàu O Bridge was still raging, and the 33rd Regiment was still stuck on the east side of the highway. A couple of days before, on June 6th, the commander and his group, including American advisors, were ambushed and cut off. Fortunately, a couple of A-37s were called in to save the group. Even without direct reinforcements coming up by Highway 13, the anti-aircraft net had been significantly diminished. Tactical airstrikes had gradually been hunting down anti-aircraft gun positions one by one throughout the battle for An Lộc. Helicopters started to fly in reinforcements throughout the next several days. 1,500 men flooded into the city with cheers from what remained of the 5th ARVN Division. The wounded could also finally be evacuated. With the reinforcements, the South Vietnamese infantry managed to clear the center of An Lộc on June 8th. Rather than wait for Highway 13 to be cleared, General Minh immediately ordered the 18th Division's 48th Regiment into An Lộc on June 13 and started to pull out the men of the 5th. The 48th Regiment managed to retake the southern hills and directly coordinate fire on Pavan positions on June 17th. With coordinated artillery support, the 81st Airborne Rangers and regular 3rd Rangers managed to retake the northern half of An Lộc, while the 7th Regiment took back the west salient. Within days, the perimeter expanded beyond the city limits. With the situation in An Lộc clearing up, the Airborne were immediately ordered to push down south and clear parts of Highway 13 on June 18th. Afterwards, they were extracted from Bình Long province via helicopter. The 81st Airborne Rangers were later extracted on the 24th. On June 18th, General Nguyễn Văn Minh, commander of 3 Corps, publicly declared that the siege of An Lộc was over. Allied intel stated that the 5th and 9th NLF divisions were withdrawing back to Cambodia. On July 7th, with An Loc secured, South Vietnamese President Nguyễn made a surprise visit to An Loc accompanied by several significant South Vietnamese generals. The president immediately promoted all soldiers, including General Hung, to the next rank, and prayed at a surviving statue of Christ. He made a speech declaring Bình Long to be a symbol of the victory to behold for the free world. At the time, I Corps was still facing the most intense fighting of the Easter Offensive. Good news from elsewhere in South Vietnam would have been very welcome. Even with An Loc secured, the last major engagement in the Battle of An Loc was at Tàu O Bridge. It was the last point of Pavan resistance. On June 18th, the 25th Division started to move up Highway 13 to help the 21st. Seeing that the 32nd was still stuck at Tàu O, General Nguyễn sent in the 46th Regiment of the 25th Division to relieve it. The 32nd Regiment had lost 40% casualties throughout its attempt to push north. The 31st Regiment continued fighting, but its senior American advisor was killed, then its own commander was killed a week later. The 21st ARVN Division was completely spent. General Min sent the rest of the 25th Division to replace the 21st. The 25th Division immediately maneuvered to surround Tàu O Bridge and destroyed the rest of the positions on July 20th. Highway 13 was declared open. It was the end of the North Vietnamese Nguyen Hoi offensive in 3 corps, and the city of An Loc remained in South Vietnamese hands. The longest siege of the Vietnam War ended in a South Vietnamese victory. Even then, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Only 6 buildings remained standing. Tragedy struck when an entourage of high-ranking American advisors, including Brigadier General Richard Tolman, second in command of TRAC, decided to visit An Loc on July 9th. Colonel Ulmer met with the general directly as he landed, but a 105mm artillery round landed nearby. The group scattered, but a second round landed directly on the general's group. Several South Vietnamese soldiers ran over to help, and a South Vietnamese military surgeon tried his best to attempt emergency surgery. Tolman was later picked up by helicopter, but wouldn't make the entire flight back. It was the highest-ranking American death of the Easter Offensive of 1972. In the next few months, the 18th ARVN Division replaced the 5th entirely and retook parts of Quan Lai. Later, the 18th itself returned to its position east of Saigon when 3 Ranger groups replaced it. Months later, the ceasefire was finally signed in January 1973. 8,000 South Vietnamese were killed in An Loc, 1,000 of them civilians. American analysts estimated that the North Vietnamese received 25,000 casualties. Hanoi admitted that more than half of its tanks were lost. American media reactions were mixed, saying that the city died bravely, focusing on South Vietnamese losses and incompetence. However, South Vietnamese performance aside, An Loc remained in our hand at the end of the Summer of Red Fire.